There's something absolutely hilarious about the pursuit of spiritual simplicity that invariably becomes more complicated than filing tax returns. No matter the era, no matter the tradition, no matter how crystal clear the teachings, someone always shows up convinced they've discovered the perfect formula for applying ancient wisdom on Monday morning at 7:15 when the alarm goes off and real life knocks on the door demanding coffee and immediate answers. And then this fascinating encounter happens between spiritual ideal and human reality that is educational. In the sense that you learn a lot about expectations versus implementation, mainly about expectations. Today we're going to explore this phenomenon through people who faced this universal situation, discovering that spiritual simplicity and human complexity meet at exactly the most inconvenient moment possible. Like when you're trying to be a better person and life decides to test your patience with compound interest. What these discoveries reveal is a truth that anyone interested in personal growth recognizes immediately. The distance between spiritual theory and human implementation is where all the comedy of the human condition happens, between what we'd like to be and what we are at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday when someone steals your parking spot. Buddha never promised it would be simple. In fact, as Master Dzongsa Rinpoche very wisely observed, although in essence it is quite simple, Buddhism does not lend itself to easy explanation. It is complex, vast, and profound, almost beyond imagination. Or, translating to our reality, even though it's simple at heart, Dharma doesn't fit in self-help manuals. It's complex, immense, and profound, almost beyond what we can imagine when we're trying to apply ancient wisdom before our first morning coffee. If you're here because you have trouble sleeping, prepare for about 2 hours of universal contradictions that will make you laugh at your own quest for spiritual perfection. If you're here because you love ancient wisdom, prepare to discover that our ancestors faced exactly the same absurd dilemmas we face today, just without meditation apps. And if you're here because you need quick solutions, well, it might be a very enlightening night about expectations versus reality. Let's start exploring how absolutely normal people discovered that the spiritual quest has always been a deliciously complicated. Ethan Blackwood had what you could call a small professional problem. He was, without question, the best blacksmith in a bustling city in ancient India in the 13th century. His swords cut through armor like a hot knife through cheese. His spears pierced shields with the elegance of someone cutting butter on a Sunday morning. And his daggers, well, his daggers were so sharp that other blacksmiths came from distant cities just to cry with envy. The problem wasn't the quality of the work. The problem was that Ethan had recently discovered the first Buddhist precept, ahimsa, non-violence. The small philosophical matter that perhaps, just perhaps, dedicating your entire life to creating instruments of death wasn't exactly compatible with the path of spiritual enlightenment. But hey, everyone has their professional contradictions, right? Ethan's forge was strategically located near the sacred river, where the rhythmic sound of hammer against metal mixed harmoniously with the morning chants from nearby temples. It was a medieval urban symphony, clang, 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 of lethal weapon creation punctuated by Om Mani Padme Hum of the quest for universal peace. Basically the perfect soundtrack for a spiritual existential crisis. Ethan had inherited the profession from his father, who had inherited it from his grandfather, who had inherited it from his great-grandfather, in a family tradition. That went back to time immemorial. The lineage was so ancient that people joked that the first Ethan had forged the weapons of the gods themselves, which was an adorable joke until you realized you were literally following the ancestral footsteps of creating instruments of divine violence. The clientele was impressive. Princes ordered ceremonial swords, generals requested spears for their troops, rich merchants wanted elegant daggers for personal protection, and Ethan made everything with expertise that bordered on the artistic. Each blade was a work of art. Each point was mathematically perfect. Each edge was so sharp it cut not only flesh and bone, but also, apparently, the conscience of whoever created them. The workshop was a small universe of contradictions. On the walls, hung with pride, were his most famous creations. The sword that had decided 3 important battles, the spear that pierced the defenses of a formidable fortress, the dagger that had resolved several diplomatic disagreements definitively. And right next to these masterpieces of destructive engineering, on a small improvised shelf, rested his recent acquisitions, 3 Buddhist texts on universal compassion. The irony wasn't exactly subtle. His assistants, 2 young men who had grown up watching Ethan transform raw metal into instruments of death with the elegance of an artist, began to notice certain behavioral changes in their master. For example, he had started murmuring, "May all beings be happy," while tempering red-hot blades, or the contemplative pause he made before sharpening each sword, as if he were mentally apologizing for his contribution to the universal cycle of violence. "Master?" asked Liam, the older assistant, watching Ethan polish a particularly lethal sword while softly humming a Buddhist mantra. "Are you well?" Ethan stopped polishing. He looked at the blade that reflected the forge's light like a deadly silver mirror. Then he looked at the text about ahimsa that was open on a nearby table. Then he looked at the sword again. "Liam," he said slowly, "have you ever wondered about professional contradictions?" "Professional contradictions, Master." "Well," Ethan gestured vaguely toward the sword, then toward the Buddhist text, then toward the sword again. "Imagine you discovered that dedicating your entire life to creating things that cut people into pieces might not be unspiritually ideal." Liam pondered this information with the seriousness of someone who had never considered philosophical questions deeper than, "Where's the hammer?" or "Is the fire hot enough?" "But Master," he said finally, "your swords are works of art. They're the best in all the land, maybe in the entire northern region." "Yes," Ethan agreed sadly, "but they also cut people." "Well, yes, that's kind of the idea." And it was exactly at that moment that Ethan Blackwood realized that his small professional problem was, in fact, considerably larger than he had initially imagined. The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning, which is traditionally when life likes to complicate things irreversibly. Ethan was walking to the market to buy iron when he passed in front of the small Buddhist temple that had been built recently near the river. Normally, he would pass right by, not for lack of spiritual interest, but because he was always in a hurry to get back to the forge and continue his prosperous career in the artisanal violence industry. But on that specific morning, the monk was outside talking to a small group about the 5 basic precepts of Buddhism. And the first precept, he explained with the serene patience of someone who never had to worry about professional contradictions, was ahimsa, not causing harm to any living being. "Ahimsa," repeated the monk, "means not only avoiding killing, but avoiding participating in any chain of violence, not creating, not facilitating, not contributing to the suffering of others." Ethan stopped walking. Not because the idea was revolutionary. Any decent person would agree that not hurting other beings was a good thing. He stopped because for the first time in his life, he made the simple mathematical connection between not contributing to the suffering of others and "I spend my days creating objects specifically designed to contribute to the suffering of others." It was the kind of moment of clarity you really would have preferred not to have on a Tuesday morning on the way to the market. "Excuse me," he said to the monk after the small group dispersed, "a quick question about this business of not contributing to violence." The monk, who had that serene expression of someone who meditates regularly and doesn't need to worry about practical matters like clientele waiting for swords by Thursday, smiled encouragingly. "Of course, my son. What's your doubt?" "Well," Ethan cleared his throat, "hypothetically speaking, if someone were, say, a blacksmith specializing in weapons—" "Ah," said the monk, and his serene expression developed a slightly educational nuance. "You make swords?" "The best in the region," Ethan confirmed automatically, before realizing that maybe this wasn't exactly the moment for professional advertising. "Interesting," murmured the monk. "And how do you feel about that?" "How do I feel about, making the best swords in the region? How do you feel about spending your days creating instruments that exist exclusively to cut other human beings into pieces?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. processing the slightly more direct reformulation of his profession. "Well," he said slowly, "when you put it that way." "That's exactly the way we should put it," said the monk gently. "Buddha taught that we should see things as they really are, not as we prefer them to be. Are your swords beautiful? Extraordinarily beautiful. Are they technically perfect? Impeccable. And what is their final purpose? To cut people. So you spend your days creating technical beauty to facilitate violence. It was impressive how someone could reformulate your entire career in such enlightening terms. Ethan had thought of himself as an artist, as a craftsman, as heir to a noble ancestral tradition. Apparently, he was also a professional facilitator of violence with artistic tendencies. Is there, he asked hopefully, some way to reconcile these things? The monk considered the question with the seriousness of someone who really understood that career transitions at 45 weren't exactly simple, especially when your only professional skill was technically incompatible with spiritual development. Buddha speaks about right livelihood, he said. The question isn't to judge what you've done so far, but to understand what you want to do from here forward. And if what I do best in the world is exactly the thing I shouldn't be doing. That, said the monk with a smile that suggested familiarity with professional existential dilemmas, is where things get interesting. Ethan returned home carrying iron to make swords and a spiritual crisis that was growing exponentially with each step. Upon arriving at the forge, he looked at his tools with a slightly different perspective. The hammer he used to shape blades, the anvil where he created perfect deadly curves, the furnace where he heated metal until it was red as blood. Everything looked exactly the same, but it also looked completely different. "Liam," he called to his assistant, "today we're going to do something experimental." "Experimental how, Master?" "We're going to try to make a sword," said Ethan slowly, "with good intentions." Liam looked at him with the expression of someone who was beginning to suspect that his master might need a vacation. "Master, swords have always been made with good intentions, the intention to cut things efficiently." And that's when Ethan realized that explaining ahimsa to someone whose only spiritual concern was cutting efficiency was going to be educational. Ethan decided that the obvious solution to his spiritual dilemma was creative rationalization. If ahimsa meant not contributing to violence, then he would simply make swords that technically didn't contribute to violence. Defensive swords, peaceful swords, Buddhist swords if necessary. It was a brilliant plan that only had one small problem. Swords don't work like that. "Liam," he announced the next morning, with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered a brilliant solution to complex philosophical problems, "today we begin a new era, the era of non-violent weapons." Liam, who was organizing the tools for another normal day of creating lethal instruments, stopped and looked at his master with the careful expression of someone who suspected they were dealing with a possible nervous breakdown. "Non-violent weapons, Master." "Exactly. From now on, we only make swords for defense, for protection, for the preservation of life." "But Master," said Liam with the relentless logic of youth, "swords preserve life by cutting other people before they cut you. The end result is still cut people." Ethan paused. That was an inconveniently accurate observation. "Yes, well," he said, "but the intention is different." "The sword's intention." "My intention in making the sword." Liam considered this. "So if you make a sword thinking of peace and love, it magically becomes non-violent?" "Not magically," Ethan corrected. "Spiritually." "And how exactly does a spiritually non-violent sword work differently from a normal sword?" It was a fair question that Ethan didn't have a particularly convincing answer for, but he decided to try anyway. The first defensive sword was commissioned by a local merchant who needed protection for a journey through territories known for bandits. Perfect, Ethan thought. Protection is clearly defensive. Protection is preservation of life. Protection is, well, it still involved the possibility of cutting bandits, but at least the initial motivation was to preserve the merchant's life. While forging, Ethan concentrated intensely on peaceful intentions. He visualized the sword protecting the merchant. He imagined it, discouraging conflicts through its mere intimidating presence. He mentally pictured scenarios where its existence would prevent violence instead of causing it. The result was technically one of his best works, perfectly balanced, impeccably sharp, absolutely lethal. "Master," observed Liam, admiring the blade, "this looks exactly like the other swords." "Ah," said Ethan, "but this one was made with peaceful intentions. And that changes." "What exactly?" "It changes everything, spiritually speaking." Liam tested the blade's edge, which cut a piece of fabric as if it were air. "It still cuts things with the same efficiency." "Yes, but now it cuts with compassion." Liam looked at the sword, then at Ethan, then at the sword again. "Master, how exactly does one cut with compassion?" It was another inconveniently insightful question for which Ethan was discovering he had no adequate answers. The merchant came to pick up the sword on Friday. Ethan handed it over, with a small speech about responsible use and defensive intentions. The merchant nodded politely and left for his journey. 2 weeks later, the merchant returned to thank him. The sword had worked perfectly. He had faced bandits exactly as expected, and the sword had fulfilled its function. "It worked magnificently," reported the merchant cheerfully. "It cut through 3 bandits as if they were made of straw." Ethan felt his stomach sink. 3 bandits? 3. Maybe 4, depending on how you count. The last one might have survived, but lost a lot of blood. "Ah." Truly it was a work of art in action. The way the blade slid through the ribs of the first... Ethan interrupted with a gesture. He didn't need the technical details of how his peaceful sword had contributed to what seemed to have been a small massacre. "I'm glad it served for protection," he said weakly. "Absolute protection. And offense too, I must say. Very versatile." After the merchant left, Ethan stood looking at his forge with a new depressive understanding. His attempt to create non-violent weapons had resulted in exactly the same amount of violence as his normal weapons. The only difference was that now he had added spiritual hypocrisy to the process. "Liam," he said sadly, "I think our experiment with peaceful weapons wasn't exactly a success." "Well, Master," said Liam pragmatically, "at least now you know that spiritual intentions don't change. The physics of sharp blades." It was a small comfort, but technically accurate. Ethan began to suspect that resolving professional contradictions between spirituality and practical reality was going to be slightly more complicated than he had initially imagined. After the failure of the peaceful swords, Ethan decided to try a different approach: advanced philosophical rationalization. If he couldn't make his weapons non-violent, perhaps he could prove that they were, in fact, necessary for the greater good of society. It was the kind of logic that works perfectly, until you try to explain it out loud. "You see, Liam," he said the following Monday, organizing his arguments like a lawyer preparing a defense, "maybe I'm thinking about this the wrong way." "How so, Master?" "Maybe making swords isn't contributing to violence. Maybe it's preventing violence." Liam, who was starting to get used to his master's mental contortions, waited patiently for the explanation. "Think of it this way," Ethan continued, warming up to his argument. "If I didn't make good swords, people would have to use bad swords. And bad swords cause more suffering because they don't cut clean. So you're saying you make efficient swords out of compassion?" "Exactly. A quick death is more compassionate than a slow death." Liam considered this. "But Master, what if instead of quick or slow deaths, there were no deaths?" "Ah," said Ethan, "but then we're entering a utopian fantasy. People will always need weapons, it's human nature. And who decides that? Well, history, tradition, practical reality. Or blacksmiths," Liam suggested, with an innocence that fooled no one. Ethan stopped organizing his tools. "What do you mean, or blacksmiths?" "Well, Master, if all blacksmiths decided to stop making weapons, maybe people would have to find other ways to resolve conflicts. But that's impossible. Why? Because there have always been blacksmiths making weapons. And there have always been people killing other people. That doesn't make it right. It was annoying how his assistant had developed this inconvenient tendency to make logical observations that complicated his carefully constructed rationalizations. "Liam," Ethan said with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child, "you're missing the main point." Which is... Ethan searched for the main point and found he couldn't quite locate it. The point is that the situation is complex. More complex than making things that kill people is bad? Much more complex. How? Well, there are economic issues, family tradition, specialized skills that don't easily transfer to other professions, clients who depend on me, a reputation built over decades. So basically, said Liam, it's complicated to stop because it would be inconvenient. It's not inconvenient, Ethan protested. It's impractical. What's the difference? The difference is that impractical sounds like a legitimate reason, and inconvenient sounds like a flimsy excuse. Liam smiled. And which of the two is it? Ethan looked at his tools, then at the swords in progress, then at the Buddhist text about ahimsa that was open on the side table. Probably, he admitted reluctantly, the second. It was depressing how self-knowledge tended to complicate perfectly functional rationalizations. "Master," said Liam gently, "perhaps the problem isn't finding ways to justify making swords. Perhaps it's discovering if you really want to continue making swords." And that was exactly the question Ethan had been trying to avoid answering. Ethan decided that the most obvious solution to his existential dilemma was professional diversification. If making swords was spiritually problematic, he would simply switch to a different market. Agricultural tools, gardening implements, household utensils, peaceful things that helped people cultivate life instead of ending it. It was a solid plan that only had one small problem. Ethan knew absolutely nothing about agriculture. "Liam," he announced on Thursday morning with the optimism of someone who had discovered a simple solution to complex problems, "today we begin our transition to peaceful tools." "What kind of peaceful tools, Master?" "Cultivation tools, to plant things, to make life grow instead of ending abruptly." Liam looked around the forge, which was clearly organized for the production of lethal weapons. "And you know how to make agricultural tools? How hard can it be? Metal is metal. The difference is just the final shape." It was a logic that revealed an impressively superficial understanding of both agriculture and tool design. The first order came from a local farmer who needed a new hoe. Ethan attacked the project with the enthusiasm of someone finally aligning career with spiritual values. He was going to make the best hoe in the region, a hoe that would last generations, a hoe that would make Buddha smile with approval. The result was technically impressive and practically useless. "Master," observed Liam, examining the creation, "this hoe looks very robust." "Robust is good," said Ethan proudly. "Durable, reliable. It also looks very heavy. Weight means quality. And very sharp." Ethan had, unconsciously, applied his sword forging techniques to agriculture. The resulting hoe was perfectly balanced, incredibly sharp, and weighed approximately 3 times more than a normal hoe. "It's a high-performance hoe," he explained, "for serious agriculture." The farmer arrived on Friday to pick up his order. He looked at the hoe with the expression of someone trying to understand what they were seeing. "It's certainly impressive," he said diplomatically. "Thank you. It will last forever." "It probably will," agreed the farmer, trying to lift the hoe and finding he needed to use both hands. "It's just that, well, hoes are usually more light. Lightness is for weak tools. And less cutting. Why would you want a tool that doesn't cut well?" The farmer considered this. "Well, because hoes aren't supposed to cut, they're supposed to dig." "Ah," said Ethan. "Interesting." It was an insight that revealed he perhaps should have researched a bit about agriculture before venturing into the agricultural tool business. "Perhaps," suggested the farmer gently, "you could make a more Traditional version? More traditional? Lighter, less sharp, more suitable for moving earth instead of cutting things. Ethan promised to consider the feedback and make adjustments. The farmer took his super hoe, clearly not knowing quite what to do with it. "Master," said Liam after the client left, "I think we've discovered a problem." "What problem?" "You're making agricultural tools as if they were weapons." "I'm making agricultural tools with high-quality standards. You made a hoe that could easily decapitate someone. That's incidental." "Master, have you ever seen anyone using a hoe?" Ethan was quiet. The honest answer was no. He had spent his entire life in a forge making weapons. His experience with agriculture was limited to observing fields from a distance while traveling between cities. "Perhaps," he admitted reluctantly, "I should observe some agricultural activities before continuing. That would be wise." On Saturday, Ethan spent the day in the fields observing farmers working. It was an educational experience. Agriculture, he discovered, involved much less violence and much more patience than he had imagined. The tools were simple, light, functional. No one needed a hoe that could cut through armor. "Liam," he said the following Monday, "I think I understand where I went wrong." "Where, Master?" "I'm trying to apply war skills to peace. It's like trying to use a catapult to plant seeds." "Technically possible, but slightly excessive." "Exactly." Ethan looked at his tools with a new, disheartening perspective. He was extraordinarily good at making things that cut, pierced, and destroyed. But making things that cultivated, built, and nourished, that required a completely different set of skills. "Master," said Liam carefully, "perhaps the problem isn't what you do, but how you think about what you do." It was an observation that would keep Ethan awake for several consecutive nights. The real crisis arrived on a Wednesday afternoon when Ethan was trying to make a sickle and realized that, without thinking, he had created what was essentially a small medieval weapon with agricultural tendencies. He stopped in the middle of the process, looked at the curved blade that was taking shape, and had that devastating moment of clarity that everyone experiences at least once in life, the realization that you may be fundamentally unsuited for the thing you always believed was your calling. "Liam," he said slowly, putting down the hammer, "I need to ask you a serious question." "Yes, Master?" "In your honest opinion, is there anything I know how to do besides creating objects that cut people?" Liam considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. After all, they had spent the last few weeks watching Ethan try to apply 2 decades of expertise in lethal metallurgy to peaceful projects, with results ranging from inadequate to potentially dangerous for agriculture. "Well, Master," he said diplomatically, "you are extraordinary at working metal." "Yes, but in metal that kills things. You're also very good at design. Design of things that pierce people. And you have an exceptional eye for proportions. Lethal proportions." "Master," said Liam gently, "perhaps the question isn't what you know how to do, but why you learn to do it." Ethan looked at his hands that he had trained for 20 years to create beauty through destruction. Every callus had a story, every scar represented a lesson learned in the process of perfecting the art of forging elegant death. "You know what the real problem is, Liam?" "What, Master?" "I'm good at this. Really. Genuinely good. Perhaps it's the only thing in the world I do better than anyone else. And that's bad? It's bad when the only thing you do better than anyone is exactly the thing your conscience is telling you to stop doing." It was the kind of irony that seemed specifically designed to teach lessons about attachment to professional identity. Ethan walked to the wall where his best creations were displayed. Each was a masterpiece of destructive engineering. The sword that had cut through 3 warriors in a single battle, the spear that pierced the shield of the champion, the dagger that, well, the dagger had resolved several diplomatic problems definitively. 20 years, he murmured, 20 years perfecting something that I now discovered to be spiritually counterproductive. "Master," said Liam, "may I suggest a different perspective?" "Please." Perhaps the problem isn't that you learned the wrong skills. Perhaps it's that you're trying to throw away who you are instead of finding a way to be who you are, differently. Ethan turned to look at his assistant. Explain that. Well, you're an artist, a master metallurgist, someone who transforms raw metal into perfect forms. The question is, do these forms always have to be lethal? But all my training, all my experience, is in creating beauty through metal. The ultimate purpose wasn't etched into your hands from birth. It was an interesting observation that Ethan hadn't considered. He had assumed that his skills were inseparably linked to the creation of weapons. But perhaps it was possible to apply the same technical expertise to different purposes. Are you suggesting I should relearn my own profession? I'm suggesting that perhaps you already know everything you need to know, just for different purposes. That night, Ethan lay awake, looking at the ceiling and thinking about identity. Who was he if he wasn't the best weapon blacksmith in the region? His hands knew how to shape metal like a musician knows how to play an instrument. But was it possible to use the same hands to create harmony instead of terminal disharmony? The real question wasn't whether he could learn new skills. The question was whether he could maintain his identity as a master craftsman while fundamentally changing what he created. Buddha, he murmured to the darkness, if you're listening, some guidance on spiritual career transitions would be much appreciated. The answer didn't come in a celestial voice. It came in the form of a slow, gradual realization that perhaps the solution wasn't to abandon who he was, but to discover who he could become. It was a subtle but potentially revolutionary difference. Liam, he said the next morning, today we're going to try something completely different. What, Master? We're going to make something beautiful that doesn't kill anyone. Like what? I don't know yet, but I know it won't have a sharp edge. It was a small but promising start. The epiphany arrived on a Sunday morning while Ethan was trying to make a bell for the Buddhist temple. Not a war bell, just a simple, peaceful bell that would call people to meditation instead of alerting them to imminent invasions. After 3 frustrated attempts that resulted in objects that sounded more like instruments of acoustic torture than invitations to spiritual contemplation, he stopped, put the hammer down, and finally understood what he had been trying to figure out for weeks. The problem wasn't his hands. The problem wasn't his tools. The problem wasn't even his experience in metallurgy. The problem was that he was trying to change what he did without changing who he was. Liam, he said, sitting heavily on a stool, I think I've been approaching this completely wrong. How so, Master? I've been trying to become a different person who does different things, but what if the answer is to continue being who I am, just being different? Liam, who had developed an impressive tolerance for his master's philosophical insights, awaited the explanation. Look, Ethan continued, picking up a piece of raw metal, when I pick this up, my hands know exactly what to do. They know how to heat, how to shape, how to refine. The metal responds to me because we understand each other. Yes, Master. But I was trying to make my hands create things that my mind didn't understand. Bells, hoes, tools. I was forcing technique without understanding. Ethan stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the nearby Buddhist temple. You know what the monk told me about ahimsa, that it's not just about external actions, it's about internal intention. It's about the mind behind the action. And I've been trying to change my actions without changing my mind. It was a realization that seemed simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. Liam, all these weeks I thought the problem was that I knew how to make swords, but the real problem is that I thought like someone who makes swords. What's the difference? The difference is that if I change how I think, perhaps I can use the same skills for completely different purposes. Ethan returned to the workbench where the malformed bell was resting as evidence of his frustrated efforts. When I made swords, every hammer blow had intention. I visualized the final shape, felt the purpose of the blade, understood exactly how each curve would serve the goal of, well, cutting things efficiently. Yes, But when I tried to make this bell, I was just hitting metal, hoping it would turn into something useful. Liam looked at the bell, which really looked more like the result of violence against metal than intentional craftsmanship. So, what are you going to do differently? I'm going to make this bell again, but this time I'm going to think like someone who is creating an invitation to peace. Every blow will be with the intention of creating sound that calms minds, not sound that alerts to danger. And that will change the result? I don't know, Ethan admitted, but it will change who I am while doing it. He rekindled the forge and began to heat the metal again. But this time, instead of thinking about techniques and procedures, he thought about purpose. He visualized monks hearing the sound of the bell and feeling peace. He imagined people walking to the temple, drawn by a gentle sonic invitation. He contemplated each note as a small gift of tranquility. For anyone within earshot, the first blow sounded different, more intentional. "Master," said Liam after observing for a few minutes, "your hands are moving differently." "Are they?" "More careful, as if you were conversing with the metal instead of forcing it." Ethan stopped and looked at his hands. Liam was right, he wasn't applying brute force as he did when creating blades that needed to be lethally efficient. He was shaping with gentleness, allowing the metal to find its natural form within the limits of what he was trying to create. "Buddha taught about internal transformation," he murmured, resuming work. "Perhaps that's the difference. Instead of trying to change what I do, I need to change how I relate to what I do." 3 hours later, the bell was ready. Ethan suspended it on an improvised structure and tested the sound with a small tap. The note that emerged was clear, deep, and had a quality that invited silence. "Master," said Liam softly, "this bell sounds peaceful." "It sounds," Ethan agreed, "as if it was made by someone who understands peace." And it was at that moment that he realized that perhaps he didn't need to stop being a blacksmith. Perhaps he needed to discover what kind of blacksmith he wanted to become. It was a possibility that changed everything, and nothing simultaneously. 6 months later, Ethan Blackwood had become something he never imagined possible: a Buddhist blacksmith. Not in the sense that he had stopped being a blacksmith, or that he had stopped being a Buddhist, but in the sense that he had discovered how to be both simultaneously without causing an existential crisis every morning. His forge still worked. His hands still knew how to shape metal like a musician knows how to play instruments. The difference was that now he made things that preserved life instead of ending it. Bells for temples, tools for doctors, implements for construction. Utensils that helped people create instead of destroy. But the most significant change wasn't in what he did, it was in how he thought about what he did. "Liam," he said on a Thursday afternoon while finishing a set of surgical instruments for the local hospital, "have you noticed something interesting?" "What, Master?" "Making these medical tools requires exactly the same precision as making swords. The difference is that one saves lives and the other doesn't. And that changes how you feel about your work completely." Ethan polished a small surgical blade that would be used to remove tumors. "Before, every piece I finished carried the weight of knowing it existed to cause harm. Now every piece carries the hope that it will help someone." It was a subtle but profound transformation. The skills were the same, the experience was the same. Even some of the techniques were identical, but the intention had changed everything. The business, curiously, was thriving. Apparently, there was considerable demand for high-quality metallurgy that wasn't related to war. Doctors wanted precise instruments. Temples needed bells and ornaments. Builders needed durable tools. Artists wanted materials for their creations. "You know what I discovered, Liam?" "What?" "All these years making weapons, I thought I was serving a fundamental human need. That violence was inevitable, so at least I ensured it was efficient. And now? Now I see that I was serving only one part of human, nature, the part that destroys. But humans also build, heal, create, celebrate, and those parts also need tools." Liam, who had become not only an assistant, but a partner in the new direction of the business, smiled. "Master, may I make an observation?" "Of course." You didn't stop being a blacksmith, you stopped being a war blacksmith. It was a distinction that Ethan had taken months to fully comprehend. He hadn't abandoned his professional identity. He had expanded his understanding of what that identity could mean. Buddha taught about the middle way, he said, examining a newly finished bell. Perhaps that applies to careers too. It's not necessary to choose between being entirely one thing or entirely another. It's possible to find a middle ground that honors both your skills and your values. The bell in his hands was a work of art. Perfect proportions, crystal clear sound, durability that ensured it would serve future generations of practitioners. It had all the technical quality of his old swords, but it existed to create peace instead of conflict. Liam, do you think Buddha would be proud of this bell? I think Buddha would be proud of how you came to this bell. It was an answer that revealed growing wisdom in his young assistant. That afternoon, the monk from the temple came to pick up the bell he had ordered. When he tested the sound, an expression of genuine satisfaction crossed his face. This bell, he said, sounds as if it was made by someone who understands Dharma. It was made by someone who is learning Dharma, Ethan corrected. I'm still discovering how to apply ahimsa in daily practice. And how is that discovery going? I discovered that ahimsa doesn't necessarily mean changing everything you do. Sometimes it means changing why you do what you do. The monk nodded. Buddha taught that the mind precedes all actions. Change the mind, and actions transform naturally. Exactly. I was trying to change actions and hoping the mind would follow, but it works better the other way around. After the monk left, Ethan stood at the door of his forge, looking at the temple where his bell would soon be calling people to meditation. The sound would travel through the city, touching anyone within earshot, offering a moment of pause in an often chaotic daily life. "Master," said Liam, "you seem at peace." "I am," Ethan agreed. "For the first time in months, I feel that my work and my values are pointing in the same direction." "And what direction is that?" "Towards creating things that make the world a little better instead of a little more dangerous." It was a simple goal that had been surprisingly complicated to achieve. But perhaps, Ethan thought, that was precisely the grace of discovering Dharma. Not that it makes life simpler, but that it makes complexity meaningful. And while Ethan finally discovered that spiritual transformation doesn't necessarily require a change of profession, just a change of perspective. On the other side of the empire, in Song, China, a woman was about to discover that spiritual purity and social purity are concepts that, apparently, never met for an educational conversation. Because if a blacksmith trying to apply ahimsa is already an interesting contradiction, wait until you meet a courtesan trying to convince monks that a pure mind is independent of a socially impure profession, which will work out in a way no one anticipated, especially the monks. Evelyn Reed had what you could call a small public image problem. She was, indisputably, the most refined artist in the trading city of Hangzhou during the Song dynasty. She knew how to play 7 different musical instruments, composed poetry that made literati weep with beauty, and mastered the art of intelligent conversation like few scholars could. The problem wasn't a lack of talent. The problem was that all this exquisite education was attached to a profession that society considered spiritually questionable. And Evelyn had recently discovered Buddhism, developed a genuine interest in spiritual awakening, and begun to suspect that perhaps there was a small contradiction between seeking mental purity and practicing the most impure profession possible according to the social standards of the time. But hey, everyone has their existential ironies, right? The tea house where Evelyn worked was strategically located in the most prosperous commercial district of Hangzhou, where wealthy merchants came to appreciate refined culture in equally refined company. It was a high-class establishment that catered only to clients with high standards and correspondingly deep pockets. Nothing vulgar or direct, everything wrapped in sophisticated layers of social ritual and artistic expression, which didn't change the basic fact that, in the eyes of Song society, it was still fundamentally an impure profession. Evelyn had discovered Buddhism accidentally, as most truly important discoveries happen. She was walking through the market on a Tuesday morning when she passed a group of monks discussing universal Buddha nature, the idea that all beings possess the potential for spiritual awakening, regardless of their external circumstances. All beings, emphasized the elder monk, carry within themselves the seed of enlightenment. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, virtuous or sinner, Buddha nature is universal and immutable. Evelyn stopped walking. Not because the idea was particularly revolutionary. She had grown up in a culture that spoke about universal human potential. She stopped because for the first time, someone was saying that spiritual awakening didn't depend on external social approval. That mental purity was an internal matter, not a matter of professional classification. It was the kind of insight that changed her perspective on identity irreversibly. "Excuse me," she said to the monk after the small group dispersed, "a question about this universal Buddha nature business." The monk, who had that serene expression of someone who meditates regularly and doesn't need to worry about complicated matters like sustaining a career in a socially marginalized profession, smiled encouragingly. "Certainly, my daughter. What's your doubt? When you say all beings, does that include people in professions that society considers problematic?" The monk studied her for a moment. Evelyn was dressed with the discreet elegance of someone who clearly belonged to the most sophisticated commercial circles of the city, but there was something in her question that suggested personal experience with social marginalization. "Buddha nature," he said carefully, "is not determined by external occupation. It is determined by internal potential for wisdom and compassion. But what if the external occupation is socially disapproved? Buddha taught that we should distinguish between the person and their actions, between essence and circumstance. And what if the circumstances are persistently complicated?" The monk was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to navigate a conversation that was becoming more complex than he had anticipated. "My daughter," he said finally, "what kind of complicated circumstances do you have in mind?" "Hypothetically speaking," said Evelyn, "what if someone worked as an artist in establishments that cater to specific social needs?" "Ah," said the monk, and his serene expression developed a slightly uncomfortable nuance. "You are a courtesan." "I am an artist who works in commercial contexts," she corrected diplomatically. "Yes, well, that's interesting." "Is it interesting in the sense of philosophically fascinating, or interesting in the sense of spiritually problematic?" It was a fair question that the monk clearly didn't have a prepared answer for. "The question," he said, buying time, "is how one can cultivate mental purity in circumstances that promote external impurity." "But you just said that Buddha nature is independent of external circumstances." "Yes, but so either Buddha nature is universal or it isn't. It can't be universal except for some specific professions." The monk was visibly uncomfortable. It was clear that he had never considered the practical implications of universal Buddha nature when applied to socially complicated cases. "Perhaps," he suggested, "you should consider a change of profession?" "And what if a change of profession wasn't practically viable?" "Why wouldn't it be viable?" Evelyn looked at him with the patience of someone explaining basic economic realities to a person who clearly had never worried about financial sustenance. "Because," she said gently, "not all of us have monasteries to support us." The real discovery happened 3 days later, when Evelyn decided that if the monks couldn't satisfactorily explain how universal Buddha nature worked in practice, she would investigate it herself, which led her to one of the most educational decisions of her life: to attend Buddhist teachings regularly while continuing to work as a courtesan, just to see if mental purity and professional impurity really were mutually exclusive. It was a spiritual experiment that promised to be enlightening. The first teaching session she attended was about metta, universal loving kindness. The monk patiently explained how to cultivate genuine compassion for all beings, without exception or discrimination. "True metta," he said, "makes no distinctions based on social status, wealth, or life choices. Loving kindness extends equally to emperor and beggar, saint and sinner. Evelyn raised her hand. A question about this universality of metta. Yes? If loving kindness doesn't discriminate, why are Buddhist teachings given only in monasteries and temples that discriminate who can enter? The monk blinked. What do you mean? Well, yesterday I tried to enter the Temple of Eternal Light to hear teachings on universal compassion, and I was denied entry because of my profession. A uncomfortable silence spread through the group. Clearly, no one had considered the practical implications of preaching universal love while practicing. Social exclusion. That's administrative, said the monk finally, not spiritual. What's the difference? The difference is that, well, temples have certain guidelines. Guidelines that contradict the teachings given within the temples. It's not a contradiction, it's appropriate management of a spiritual environment. Evelyn considered this. So, universal love works better in environments that exclude certain people. It's not exclusion, it's maintaining purity. Ah, said Evelyn, so we've reached the interesting point. What kind of purity are we discussing? Spiritual purity, obviously. And how exactly would my presence compromise the spiritual purity of others? The monk clearly hadn't prepared logical arguments for this line of questioning. Well, your profession involves activities that are spiritually problematic. More problematic than refusing to teach compassion to someone who genuinely wants to learn. Compassion. It was a question that created another uncomfortable silence. My daughter, said the monk with the patience of someone trying to explain complex concepts to a seemingly dense person. You don't understand. There's external purity and internal purity. Both are important. Interesting, said Evelyn. Can you explain the difference? External purity involves avoiding actions and environments that contaminate the body and mind. Internal purity involves cultivating virtuous mental states. And what if someone cultivated virtuous mental states regardless of their external actions being in socially disapproved environments? That would be complicated. Complicated how? Well, how can you have a pure mind if you're constantly involved in impure activities? Evelyn smiled. It was exactly the question she had been waiting for. May I ask a different question? How do you know if my mind is pure or impure? Well, your actions suggest my professional actions. But do you know my thoughts, my feelings, my intentions when I'm working? The monk was quiet. Because, Evelyn continued, when I'm serving tea to a lonely merchant far from home, I'm thinking of offering gentle companionship to someone who needs human connection. When I'm playing music for a group of men who had a difficult business day, I'm thinking of bringing beauty and peace to their agitated minds. But the nature of the work. The nature of the work is to provide intelligent companionship, refined conversation, and artistic expression for people who value these things. If you see that as impure, perhaps the problem is with your perception, not with my mind. The silence this time was different, more contemplative. Besides, Evelyn added, I practice daily meditation, study texts on compassion, and do my best to treat every client with genuine kindness and interest in their well-being. How exactly is that less pure than refusing to teach Dharma to someone because of their occupation? The monk looked at her for a long moment. You're suggesting, he said slowly, that mental purity can exist independently of external social approval? I'm suggesting that perhaps mental purity is a matter between me and my own conscience, not between me and other people's opinions about how I should earn a living. But Buddha taught about right livelihood. Buddha also taught about not judging others, and about distinguishing between appearance and reality, and about looking beyond superficial social categories to see universal Buddha nature. It was an argument that the monk clearly hadn't considered before. You are, he said finally, presenting a unconventional perspective on Buddhist practice. I'm presenting a practical perspective on Buddhist teachings, Evelyn corrected. The question is whether the teachings are true enough to work in the real world. And that was exactly the question that would change everything. After her enlightening conversation about mental versus social purity, Evelyn decided that the best way to deepen her Buddhist studies would be to attend more temples and monasteries for formal teachings. It was a logical plan that only had one small problem. Most religious establishments had very specific policies about who was welcome to study Dharma, and courtesans, apparently, were not on the approved list. "It's a matter of decorum," explained the doorman of the Monastery of Perpetual Serenity when Evelyn tried to join a session on the Four Noble Truths. "We cannot have people of certain professions mixing with serious students." "Ah," said Evelyn, "and how do you determine who is a serious student?" "Well, serious students are people who live lives appropriate for spiritual study." "And what makes a life appropriate for spiritual study?" The doorman looked at her as if the question was slightly dense. "Lives that don't involve questionable activities." "Interesting. And who decides which activities are questionable?" "It's obvious. To you, perhaps. To me, it seems arbitrary." "My lady," said the doorman with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts, "monasteries are sacred places. We cannot allow them to be contaminated." "Contaminated by what?" "By my physical presence. By impure influences." Evelyn considered this. "So you're saying that my participation in a discussion about universal suffering would make the teaching less true?" "Not less true, less appropriate." "Ah, so spiritual truth is appropriate only in socially approved contexts?" The doorman began to look slightly annoyed. "Madam, you are complicating a simple matter." "I'm simplifying a matter that seems artificially complicated. Either Buddha taught Dharma to all beings, or he taught it only to socially approved beings. Which is it?" "Well, Buddha taught to all, but interpretation and application require appropriate discernment. And who provides that discernment? You?" "The monastic tradition. The same monastic tradition that never had to support itself financially outside of donations?" It was an observation that clearly touched a sensitive point. "Madam," said the doorman firmly, "our decision is final." The second monastery was slightly more subtle. The Temple of Infinite Compassion allowed her to enter, but when they discovered her profession, they suggested alternatives. "Perhaps," said the monk responsible for the teachings, "you would be more comfortable in separate sessions for people in special circumstances." "Special circumstances?" "People who need additional guidance before they are ready for traditional studies." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Are you suggesting that I am less capable of understanding teachings on universal compassion because of my profession?" "Not less. Capable. Just differently prepared." "And what would be the practical difference between these special sessions and the regular teachings?" "Well, we would focus more on basic fundamentals, morality, preliminary purification." "Purification of what?" "Of the influences that your profession has created in your mind." "What specific influences?" The monk seemed uncomfortable. "Well, attachments, desires, confusions about appropriate relationships." "Interesting," said Evelyn. "Have you personally evaluated my mind, or are you assuming based on professional stereotypes?" "It's a matter of probability. Certain professions tend to create certain mental patterns. Like the monastic profession tends to create patterns of judgment based on external appearances." The silence that followed was educational. "Madam," said the monk finally, "we are not judging. We are being prudent." "Prudent about what?" "About mixing people at different stages of spiritual development." "And how did you measure my stage of spiritual development?" "Well, your profession suggests..." "My profession suggests that I know how to offer gentle companionship, intelligent conversation, and refined artistic expression. How does that indicate my level of understanding of impermanence or interdependence?" The monk clearly had no answer for that. Besides, Evelyn continued, if you truly believe in universal compassion, wouldn't it be more compassionate to include people you believe to be spiritually behind instead of segregating them? It's complicated. It's convenient, Evelyn corrected. It's easier to preach about universal compassion to people who already fit your definitions of appropriate. The third temple didn't even allow her to explain why she was there. As soon as they discovered her profession, the conversation ended. Sorry, said the doorman, but we have clear policies. Policies about what? About maintaining an appropriate environment for spiritual practice. And my presence would make the environment inappropriate? Potentially disruptive, yes. Disruptive to whom? To other practitioners. And if other practitioners are disturbed by the presence of someone seeking the same teachings as them, what kind of practitioners are they? It was a question that apparently ended the conversation. After 3 frustrated attempts, Evelyn sat on a public bench near the river and contemplated the irony of the situation. She was being rejected by institutions dedicated to teaching universal compassion, by people who apparently had never considered whether their own actions reflected the teachings they professed. Perhaps, she murmured to herself, the problem isn't where to find true Dharma. Perhaps it's recognizing where false Dharma is being masked as tradition. It was a realization that would completely change her approach to Buddhist study. After being rejected by 3 consecutive religious establishments, Evelyn decided that perhaps the problem wasn't the monasteries. Perhaps the problem was herself. Perhaps, if she changed professions, she could finally access appropriate Buddhist teachings and develop the spiritual purity she clearly lacked. It was a logic that made perfect sense, until she tried to implement it in practice. Chloe, she said to her closest friend, another artist who worked in the same tea house, I need your advice on an existential matter. Existential how? I'm considering a career change. Chloe almost dropped the tea she was serving. Change to what? Something more spiritually appropriate. Like what? I don't know yet. Maybe a seamstress? A merchant? Something that doesn't offend Buddhist sensibilities. Chloe looked at her with the expression of someone trying to determine if her friend was feverish. Evelyn, you can play 7 instruments, compose poetry that makes literati weep, and maintain intelligent conversation on any topic. And you want to sew? If that's what it takes to study Dharma properly. Have you ever tried sewing? How hard can it be? It was a question that revealed an optimistic understanding of professional skill transfer. Evelyn spent the next week experimenting with appropriate professions. First, she tried working in a fabric shop. She discovered that, although she could appreciate the beauty of the materials, she had absolutely no aptitude for cutting, measuring, or creating functional clothes. Madam, said the owner diplomatically, after 3 days of experimentation, perhaps your talents are more suited to other areas. What other areas? Areas that don't involve accidental destruction of expensive silk. Next, she tried selling food in the market. That lasted exactly a day and a half. The problem, explained the veteran merchant who had agreed to mentor her, is that you treat every client as if they were an honored guest in an elegant house. And that's bad? It's inefficient. In the market, you need to serve many people quickly. Don't compose poems about the spiritual beauty of vegetables for every client. But the vegetables are genuinely beautiful, and people seem to appreciate the poetic observation about... Evelyn, he interrupted gently, you're not a merchant, you're an artist. The third attempt was teaching children. That seemed promising. Surely educating young minds was a spiritually appropriate profession. It lasted 3 days. The problem, explained the children's mother, is that you're teaching my 7-year-old daughter about complex metaphors in classical poetry. She showed interest, and my 5-year-old son about advanced musical harmony. He has a natural ear, and both now refuse to do anything that isn't artistically inspiring. Is that bad? When it includes refusing to eat anything that isn't harmoniously presented, and insisting that household chores should be performed with poetic sensibility, yes. After a week of consecutive professional failures, Evelyn returned to the tea house feeling confused and slightly humiliated. "How was your exploration of alternative careers?" asked Chloe with genuine curiosity. "Educational," Evelyn replied sadly. "I discovered that I am completely unsuited for any profession that doesn't involve what I already do." "And that surprises you? Should it surprise me?" "Evelyn, you've spent 15 years perfecting very specific skills, refined conversation, artistic performance, understanding of complex social nuances. Why would you expect to be instantly competent at something completely different?" It was a fair question that Evelyn hadn't adequately considered, because I thought that if I changed my profession, I could purify my mind. "Ah," said Chloe, "so you believe your mind is impure?" "Well, that's what all the monks are saying." "And do you feel your mind is impure?" Evelyn paused to consider the question. "When I'm meditating, I feel peace. When I'm serving clients, I feel genuine compassion for what they need. When I'm playing music, I feel connection to something greater than myself. Does that sound impure to you?" "No." "Then perhaps the problem isn't your mind. Perhaps it's other people's interpretation of your mind." It was a distinction that Evelyn hadn't clearly made before. "Are you suggesting I should ignore monastic opinions?" "I'm suggesting that you should trust your own experience. You know your mind better than anyone who has never talked to you for more than 5 minutes." "But they are spiritual experts." "Experts in monastic life," Chloe corrected. "That doesn't automatically make them experts in your life." "So, what should I do?" "Perhaps stop trying to change who you are to fit other people's expectations and start discovering how to be who you are, more fully." It was a suggestion that sounded simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. "But how can I study Dharma if no one wants to teach me?" Chloe smiled. "Perhaps you are already studying Dharma, just not in the way the monasteries expected." After discovering that she was fundamentally unsuited for any profession other than the one she already practiced, Evelyn decided to try a different approach. If she couldn't change what she did, perhaps she could change how she did it. Specifically, apply Buddhist mindfulness directly to her work as a courtesan. It was an experiment that promised to be educational for all parties involved. "Chloe," she announced on a Monday morning, "today I'm going to try something completely new." "What kind of new thing?" "I'm going to practice meditation during work." Chloe almost choked on her tea. "How exactly does one meditate while entertaining clients?" "Mindfulness isn't about sitting in silence. It's about conscious attention to the present moment and total presence with whoever is in front of you." "That sounds philosophically interesting and practically complicated." "That's why it's an experiment." The first test came that afternoon, when a middle-aged silk merchant arrived clearly stressed after a difficult day of negotiations. Normally, Evelyn would have offered light conversation and music to distract him from his worries. This time, she decided to apply total contemplative attention to the situation. Instead of simply serving tea, she mindfully observed the process: the steam rising from the hot water, the gentle sound of porcelain against porcelain, the aroma of the infusing leaves. Every movement became a small meditation on impermanence and interdependence. "This tea," commented the merchant, "has a different taste today." "It's the same tea as always," said Evelyn. "Perhaps the difference is the attention." "Attention?" "When we pay full attention to what we're doing, even simple activities become more vivid." The merchant considered this as he slowly savored the tea. "You're right. I couldn't remember the last time I truly savored something instead of simply consuming." Encouraged, Evelyn continued the experiment. When the merchant began to complain about frustrating negotiations, instead of simply agreeing sympathetically, she applied contemplative attention to his words. She listened not only to the content, but to the underlying emotions: frustration, anxiety, loneliness. "It seems," she said gently, "that you're carrying a lot of weight alone." "How do you know that?" "When we truly listen to someone, we can hear not only what they say, but what they feel." "And what do you hear in me?" Someone who works very hard, worries about many people, and rarely has the opportunity to be simply human with someone. The merchant was quiet for a long moment. "That's exactly it," he said finally. "How did you see that?" "I didn't see, I just paid attention." The result was surprising. Instead of the usual superficial interaction, the merchant spent 2 hours in a genuine conversation about loneliness, purpose, and what truly mattered in life. When he left, he seemed lighter. "Evelyn," said Chloe, observing from a distance, "what did you do to that man? He seemed transformed." "I just practiced total attention, genuine listening, mindful presence. And that's different from what you normally do." Evelyn thought about it. "It's more intentional, more conscious, as if every moment were an opportunity to practice real compassion." The second test came on Friday, with a young client who was clearly nervous, probably his first visit to an establishment like that. Normally, Evelyn would have tried to reassure him with casual conversation. This time, she applied contemplative attention to his anxiety. "You seem worried," she observed gently. "A little," he admitted. "About what?" "I don't know exactly what to expect or how to behave." Evelyn smiled with genuine compassion. "How about we just talk, like two people who just met? Is that it? Why would it have to be more complicated?" They spent the afternoon talking about poetry — he was a literature student — and music. Evelyn played some compositions she had written, and he shared poems he was trying to write. It was an afternoon of genuine intellectual and artistic connection. "Evelyn," he said as he left, "this was nothing like I expected." "How did you expect?" "More superficial, less human." "All human interactions can be superficial or profound. The choice is ours." "You made it seem sacred somehow." It was an observation that made her stop and think. That night, talking to Chloe about the experiment, Evelyn had a realization. "Chloe, I think I've discovered something important." "What?" "When I apply total mindfulness to my work, it's not changing what I do, it's revealing what I've always been doing." "Which is?" "Offering genuine presence, compassionate attention, sacred space for people to be vulnerable and human. And that's different from spiritual practice. When how?" "It's not different," Evelyn realized. "It's spiritual practice, just not recognized as such." It was a discovery that would completely change her understanding of mental purity and impure work. The real crisis came on a Thursday morning when Evelyn, emboldened by her discoveries about applied mindfulness, decided to directly confront the Monastery of Perpetual Serenity about its exclusion policies. If she could transform impure work into spiritual practice, she could certainly challenge the logic behind religious discrimination. It was a courageous decision that quickly proved to be educational about the difference between theoretical principles and practical implementation. "I come here," she announced to the doorman who had rejected her weeks earlier, "not to ask for entry, but to understand the logic behind the exclusion." The doorman sighed. "Madam, we have already explained our position. You explained that you maintain purity, but you didn't explain what kind of purity or how my presence would specifically compromise it. It's obvious. To you, perhaps. To me, it seems arbitrary and potentially contradictory to the teachings you profess." "How so contradictory?" "Well," said Evelyn, organizing her arguments like a lawyer preparing a case, "you teach metta, universal loving kindness, but you practice social exclusion. How does that work?" "Metta doesn't mean accepting any behavior." "Am I asking about behavior or about people? People who choose problematic behaviors." "Ah, so you judge people based on assumptions about their behaviors?" The doorman began to look uncomfortable. "We don't judge. We apply prudent guidelines." "Guidelines based on what?" "Tradition. The same tradition that teaches non-judgment and universal compassion. It's different." "How is it different?" At this moment, a senior monk appeared, clearly alerted to the discussion. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. "No problem," said Evelyn. just curiosity about how you reconcile universal teachings with exclusionary practices. The monk studied her for a moment. You are the artist who has questioned our policies. I am someone interested in studying Dharma, who has questioned why that apparently isn't possible. It is possible, just not here. Why? Because your presence would be disruptive to other practitioners. Disruptive how? Well, they might feel uncomfortable. And if other practitioners feel uncomfortable with the presence of someone seeking the same teachings as them, what kind of universal compassion have they truly developed? It was a question that created a notable silence. Besides, Evelyn continued, I have been practicing mindfulness during my work for the past few weeks, applying total attention, compassionate listening, genuine presence with everyone I meet. How is that less Buddhist practice than sitting in a room listening to lectures on compassion? Because, said the monk firmly, real practice requires a pure environment. Define pure environment. An environment free from corrupting influences. And my influence is corrupting. How? Your profession that promotes attachment, desire, confusion about appropriate relationships. Based on what do you make that assessment? Have you talked to me about my practice, observed how I interact with clients, examined my mental state? It's not necessary. The nature of the profession, Evelyn interrupted, is to offer refined companionship, intelligent conversation, and artistic expression. If you see that as corrupting, perhaps the problem is your perception, not my practice. Madam, said the monk with growing irritation, you are distorting. I'm applying basic logic to obvious contradictions. You profess teachings about looking beyond superficial appearances to see universal Buddha nature, but you judge based exclusively on superficial professional appearances. It's different. How? Because... The monk searched for an explanation he didn't find. May I suggest, said Evelyn gently, that perhaps you are confusing spiritual purity with social privilege, that it's easier to teach about compassion to people who already fit your definitions of respectability? That's insulting. It's observation. You preach about transcending social categories while maintaining social categories. You teach about seeing beyond appearances while judging based on appearances. Our guidelines exist for what? To protect serious students from contact with reality, to ensure that Dharma remains comfortably abstract. The silence this time was long and tense. Evelyn, said a new voice. She turned to see an elder monk approaching. May I speak with you? Privately. Of course. They walked to a more secluded corner. Your questions, he said quietly, are disturbing. Disturbing how? Disturbing because they are valid. It was an admission that completely changed the tone of the conversation. You are forcing us to examine contradictions that we prefer not to see, he continued, and that's problematic. It's inconvenient. Ah, said Evelyn, so we've reached the real point. It's not about spiritual purity. It's about social convenience. The monk looked at her for a long moment. Perhaps, he said finally, you should be teaching Dharma, not just studying. It was an observation that would leave Evelyn thinking for weeks. The epiphany arrived 3 days later, not in a dramatic moment of sudden insight, but on a perfectly ordinary afternoon while Evelyn was serving tea to an elderly client who had recently lost his wife. He wasn't there for entertainment. He was there because he needed someone to talk to about loss, loneliness, and how to keep living when the most important person in his life had passed away. And as Evelyn listened with total attention, offered compassionate presence, and held space for his pain without trying to fix it or explain it, she realized something that completely changed her understanding of spiritual purity. She was doing exactly what any spiritual master would do. Thank you, said the man as he left, for allowing me to just be human for a few hours. Thank you for trusting me with your pain, she replied. After he left, Evelyn sat in silence, processing what had just happened. There was nothing impure about that interaction. There was just two people connecting through shared vulnerability. Compassion offered and received. Sacred space created through authentic presence. "Chloe," she said that night, "I think I finally understand." "Understand what?" "Why the monks are so afraid to let me study Dharma with them." "Why?" "Because I'm already practicing Dharma, and that exposes that they are talking about Dharma." It was a distinction that revealed the difference between lived spirituality and theorized spirituality. "Explain that," said Chloe. "For weeks, I've been trying to find someone to teach me about universal compassion, mindful presence, non-judgmental listening. But I was already doing these things, daily, with everyone I meet. And that's problematic? It's problematic for people who believe that spiritual practice only happens in socially approved contexts. My existence as a practitioner challenges that belief." Evelyn stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the nearby temple. "You know what the real difference is between what I do and what they do?" "What?" "They talk about looking beyond superficial appearances to see universal Buddha nature. I actually do that. Every day. With stressed merchants, nervous young men, lonely elders, I see beyond their social masks to the vulnerable humanity underneath. And them? They see my social appearance and stop there." It was an irony that seemed almost intentional. "Chloe, I've been trying to prove that I'm spiritually pure enough to study Dharma. But spiritual purity isn't about external approval. It's about internal authenticity. And do you feel authentic? When I'm offering total presence to someone who needs to be heard. When I'm holding space for someone's pain without trying to change it. When I'm seeing beyond social defenses to the real person underneath. Yes, I feel more authentic than ever." Evelyn turned to Chloe with a clarity that had been building for weeks. "You know what I realized? Mental purity has nothing to do with what work you do or where you live or what clothes you wear. It has to do with how you relate to other beings. If you truly see them, if you treat them with genuine kindness, if you offer presence without an agenda." "And do you do that?" "I do that more consistently than any monk I've met." It was an assessment that might sound arrogant, but it was based on practical observation. "Chloe, how many times have you seen monks rejecting people based on appearances, making judgments about who is appropriate for spiritual teachings?" "Several. And how many times have you seen me rejecting a client based on appearances, judging someone as inappropriate for compassion?" "Never. So who is truly practicing non-judgment and universal acceptance?" It was a question that answered itself. "Evelyn," said Chloe slowly, "are you saying that your profession is spiritual practice?" "I'm saying that any profession can be spiritual practice if you approach it with awareness, compassion, and the intention to serve the well-being of others. And what if others don't see it that way? Then the problem is with their perception, not with my practice." Evelyn sat down again, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in months. "You know what the real difference is between mental purity and social purity?" "What?" "Mental purity is about how you treat people when no one is watching. Social purity is about how you appear when everyone is watching. And which is more important? For real spiritual development, the first; for social approval, the second. And you choose. I choose to stop trying to impress people who confuse appearance with reality." It was a decision that freed Evelyn to be exactly who she already was, a spiritual practitioner who simply didn't fit into conventional categories. "Chloe," she said with a smile that reflected new confidence, "I think I've finally found my Dharma teacher." "Who?" "My own experience." 2 months later, Evelyn had found something she didn't know she was looking for, a teacher who taught Dharma without caring who you were when you weren't studying Dharma. Master Lee was an itinerant monk who gave teachings in the market, in tea houses, in public gardens, anywhere where people were interested in learning. He had appeared in the city on a Tuesday morning and started a discussion about interdependence using the silk trade as an example. "Look," he said to a mixed group of merchants, artisans, and curious onlookers, This silk came from silkworms that depended on mulberry leaves, which depended on soil and rain, which depended on cosmic cycles. The weaver depended on tools made by blacksmiths, who depended on ore extracted by miners. The merchant depends on roads built by workers, protected by guards, maintained by tax collectors. It was the kind of teaching that made abstract concepts immediately comprehensible. Nothing, he continued, exists independently, neither silk nor people nor judgments about who deserves spiritual teachings. This last observation was delivered looking directly at Evelyn. After the session, she approached. "Master," she said, "may I ask a question about universal Buddha nature?" "Certainly." "If all beings possess the potential for awakening, why do some teachers discriminate who can study?" Master Li smiled. "Perhaps because they confuse purity with privilege, or because it's easier to teach about compassion to people who don't challenge their own limitations. So it's not a problem with the students? Often it's a problem with the teachers." It was a refreshingly direct answer. "Would you accept a student whose profession is socially questionable?" "I would accept anyone genuinely interested in reducing suffering, their own and others, even if that person were a courtesan, especially if they were a courtesan." "Why especially?" "Because someone who works with daily human vulnerability already understands more about suffering and compassion than most monks." It was a perspective no one else had offered. In the following weeks, Evelyn studied with Master Li whenever he was in the city. The teachings took place in public places, with mixed audiences that included people from all professions and social classes. Merchants sat next to artisans, government officials learned alongside domestic workers, and courtesans studied Dharma alongside anyone who showed up. "The question isn't who you are externally," explained Master Li during a session on the Four Noble Truths, "but how you relate to your own suffering and the suffering of others." "And what if your profession is considered a cause of suffering?" asked one of the participants, looking significantly at Evelyn. "Good question," said Master Li. "Evelyn, how would you answer?" "I would say," she replied calmly, "that any profession can cause or alleviate suffering, depending on how it is practiced. The question is, when you interact with others, are you increasing or decreasing their pain? And in your experience?" "In my experience, when I offer genuine presence, compassionate listening, and safe space for people to be vulnerable, I am decreasing suffering." "Even in commercial contexts?" "Especially in commercial contexts, because often it's the only place where certain people allow themselves to be truly human." The participant who had asked the question was quiet, clearly considering this perspective. "Interesting," said Master Li. "Anyone else want to comment on how different professions can be vehicles for compassionate practice?" What followed was a fascinating discussion about how carpenters practiced mindfulness through attention to manual labor, how merchants developed patience dealing with difficult clients, how doctors cultivated equanimity in the face of inevitable suffering. "Look," concluded Master Li, "Dharma isn't something you study separately from life. It's something you discover through life. Any life, honestly lived." After the session, Evelyn stayed to talk to the master. "Thank you," she said, "for not making me feel like I need to change who I am to study Dharma." "Evelyn," he said, "you don't need to change who you are. You need to discover who you really are beyond any social role. And what if who I really am includes my profession? Then it includes. The question isn't what you do, but how you do it. With what intention? With what level of awareness? And do you believe I can develop genuine wisdom without abandoning my work? I believe you are already developing wisdom through your work. Just now you have a context to understand it." 6 months later, Evelyn still worked in the same tea house. She still offered refined companionship, intelligent conversation, and artistic expression to clients who valued these things. The difference was that now she understood her work as continuous spiritual practice. Every interaction was an opportunity to practice total presence. Every conversation was a chance to offer non-judgmental listening. Every moment was a possibility to see universal Buddha nature in the person in front of her. "Chloe," she said on a Thursday afternoon, "you know what the final irony is." "What?" "I searched all over the city for someone to teach me about mental purity, and I discovered that I was teaching it to myself then every day." "How?" "Through every act of genuine compassion, every moment of authentic presence, every time I looked beyond appearances to see the real person." It was a discovery that retrospectively transformed her entire professional experience into a spiritual curriculum. "And the monks who rejected you? I hope one day they discover that true Dharma doesn't care about their opinions on who deserves to access it." It was a generous hope that reflected genuinely developed wisdom, and while Evelyn finally discovered that mental purity and social purity are concepts that apparently never met for an honest conversation, on the other side of the continent in Burma, a soldier was about to discover that applying universal loving kindness on the battlefield is logistically more complicated than Buddhist texts suggest. Because if a courtesan convincing monks about universal Buddha nature is already an educational contradiction, wait until you meet a warrior trying to love his enemies while they are actively trying to pierce him with spears, which will work out exactly as you'd expect, especially during battles. Alex Stone had what you could call a small conflict between professional duty and spiritual development. He was, without question, one of the most competent soldiers in the Royal Army of Burma in the 16th century. He knew how to use 17 different types of weapons. He could plan military strategies that made veteran generals weep with admiration, and he mastered the art of war like few warriors of his generation could. The problem wasn't military incompetence. The problem was that Alex had recently discovered metta, universal loving kindness, and begun to suspect that perhaps, just perhaps, dedicating his life to activities that involved piercing people with sharp objects wasn't exactly compatible with cultivating compassion for all living beings. But hey, everyone has their vocational contradictions, right? The barracks where Alex served were strategically located near a land of ancient temples, where hundreds of Buddhist temples dotted the landscape, as constant reminders that Burma was officially a Theravada Buddhist kingdom. It was geographically impossible to escape the sound of bells calling to meditation, morning chants about loving kindness, or discussions about the first Buddhist precept, not causing harm to living beings. All of this created a slightly ironic soundtrack for someone whose profession was causing harm to living beings efficiently and strategically. Alex had discovered metta through a military monk. Yes, Burma had monks who served as spiritual advisors for soldiers because apparently someone had decided that war and Buddhist spirituality could coexist harmoniously. It was a combination that worked perfectly well, until you started to think about the practical implications. Metta, explained the Venerable Master during his weekly lectures to the troops, is loving kindness that extends to all beings, without exception. We begin by wishing happiness for ourselves, then for loved ones, then for neutrals, then for enemies. Alex had raised his hand. Venerable, a question about this enemy part. Yes? When you say wish happiness for enemies, does that include enemies who are actively trying to kill us, especially those enemies? Ah, and how does that work during real combat? The monk had paused, clearly not expecting such specific practical application questions. Well, metta is an ideal, something to aspire to. But practically speaking, if I'm in a battle and someone is trying to cut off my head with a sword, should I wish happiness for him? In theory, yes. And that doesn't interfere with not letting him cut off my head? It was a valid, logistical question that the monk clearly hadn't fully considered. The point, he said diplomatically, is to maintain loving kindness in the heart, even in challenging circumstances. Even in circumstances where loving kindness can result in premature death? Well, self-defense is different. Different how? It's complicated. Alex had left that conversation with more questions than answers, and a growing suspicion that applying metta in a military context was going. to be more complex than the text suggested. His fellow soldiers began to notice certain behavioral changes in Alex. For example, he had started murmuring, "May all beings be happy," before battles, or the contemplative pause he made before using any weapon, as if he were mentally apologizing for his contribution to the universal cycle of violence. "Alex?" asked Ben Carter, his closest combat partner, observing him meditate silently before a reconnaissance mission. "Are you, well?" Alex stopped meditating. He looked at his spear, which was sharpened for maximum lethal efficiency. Then he looked at the text about meta that he had started carrying with him. Then he looked at the spear again. "Ben," he said slowly, "have you ever wondered about professional contradictions?" "Professional contradictions?" "Well," Alex gestured vaguely toward the spear, then toward the Buddhist text, then toward the spear again. "Imagine you discovered that dedicating your entire life to piercing people might not be spiritually ideal." Ben pondered this information with the seriousness of someone who had never considered philosophical questions deeper than, "Where's the enemy?" or "Is my armor secure?" "But Alex," he said finally, "you're an excellent warrior. You protect our kingdom. You defend our people." "Yes," Alex agreed sadly, "but I also pierce people from other kingdoms who probably have families and dreams and universal Buddha nature." "Well, yes, that's kind of the idea of war. But what if the idea of war is incompatible with the idea of universal loving kindness?" Ben looked at him with the expression of someone who was beginning to suspect that deep philosophical discussions might not be ideal before military missions. "Alex," he said carefully, "perhaps you should talk to the Venerable Master about this." "I already have. He said it's complicated." "And that doesn't answer your question?" "Not really. Complicated isn't a practical strategy for applying loving kindness during combat." And it was exactly at that moment that Alex Stone realized that his small spiritual question was, in fact, considerably more complex than he had initially imagined. The real discovery happened on a Saturday morning during the first battle after Alex had begun his serious studies on meta. It was a minor conflict, a border skirmish with a tribe that had attacked nearby villages, but it offered the perfect opportunity to test if universal loving kindness worked in practical applications, which proved to be an educational experiment about the difference between spiritual theory and physical reality. Alex had spent the entire morning before the battle meditating on metta, following the traditional instructions. First, he cultivated loving kindness for himself. "May I be happy. May I be at peace. May I be free from suffering." Then he extended it to his fellow soldiers, then to the civilians they were protecting. And then, following the instructions to the letter, he extended metta to the enemies he was about to face. "May all beings be happy," he murmured as he checked his weapons. "May all beings be at peace. May all beings be free from suffering." It was a spiritual preparation that created an interesting mental state for combat. The battle began like most battles, with a lot of confusion, a lot of noise, and people trying to pierce other people with sharp objects. Alex found himself face to face with an enemy warrior who clearly had excellent training and very specific intentions about what to do with the spear in his hands. And it was at that exact moment that Alex tried to apply practical metta. "May you be happy," he thought sincerely as he dodged a lunge that would have permanently removed his head. The enemy warrior, not being a practicing Buddhist, responded with a series of attacks that demonstrated considerable martial skill and zero interest in universal happiness. "May you be at peace," Alex continued mentally, blocking a blow that would have opened his chest like a letter. The response was a sequence of movements that suggested his opponent was, in fact, very much at peace, with the idea of turning Alex into a battle statistic. "May you be free from suffering," Alex completed the traditional mantra, at the same time realizing that applying metta during deadly combat created a slightly problematic conflict of attention. Because while one part of his mind was genuinely wishing well-being for his opponent, another part was busy calculating attack angles, response speed, and the best way to incapacitate someone who clearly didn't share his recent interests in universal compassion. The result was confusing. Alex discovered that it was possible to feel genuine loving kindness for someone while simultaneously trying to prevent them from cutting you into pieces. But it was a cognitively exhausting experience that required a type of mental multitasking for which no military manual had prepared him. How interesting, he thought as he parried another attack. I really hope this man is happy, but I also really hope he stops trying to kill me. It was a combination of feelings that didn't appear in any meta-text he had read. The situation became even more complicated when Alex realized that he was having difficulty finishing the combat. Not due to technical incompetence. His military skills were working perfectly, but because every time he had an opening to decisively incapacitate his opponent, a part of his mind protested, "But I just wished him happiness." "May all beings be free from suffering" had become a slightly ironic mantra when you were trying to cause enough suffering to neutralize an active threat. The combat ended when his opponent tripped on a rock and fell, allowing Alex to disarm him without causing permanent injury. It wasn't exactly a glorious military victory, but it was a solution that preserved both his life and his new spiritual principles, more or less. "Alex," Ben ran to him after the skirmish ended, "how was applying your new philosophy in real battle?" Alex sat heavily on a rock, processing the experience. "It was educational," he said slowly. "Educational how? I learned that it's possible to feel loving kindness for someone while they're trying to kill you, but it's cognitively challenging. And did it work? Define worked. You survived and he survived. Does that count? Counts as partial success, but I'm not sure if it was due to meta or despite meta." Ben looked at him with the expression of someone trying to understand a completely new concept. "So you really managed to love your enemy while fighting him?" "I managed to sincerely wish him happiness," said Alex. "Only preferably happy somewhere far from me. And without weapons. Is that meta? Honestly, I don't know, but it's the closest I could get to universal love while someone was trying to turn my head into a decoration for their spear." It was a small but confusing start for practical application of universal compassion in combat contexts. "Ben," said Alex finally, "I think I discovered that meta during battle is more complicated than the texts suggest." "More complicated how?" "More complicated in the sense that, apparently, no one who wrote about universal meta ever tried to apply it while dodging sharp objects. It was an observation that would significantly influence his future experiments with military compassion. After his first confusing experience applying meta during real combat, Alex decided that the obvious solution was advanced creative rationalization. If universal loving kindness seemed incompatible with piercing people, perhaps he could recontextualize piercing people as an expression of universal loving kindness. It was a logic that worked perfectly in theory. "Venerable Master," he said during the next spiritual counseling session, "I have a question about applied meta." "Of course, my son. If I pierce an enemy to protect innocent civilians, can that be considered an act of loving kindness?" The monk paused in the middle of organizing his texts, clearly not expecting such specific military moral philosophy questions. "How so?" "Well, if I allow enemies to kill innocent people because I'm practicing non-violence, wouldn't that be a lack of compassion for the innocent? That's an interesting perspective. So violence to protect vulnerable people can be an expression of meta. Well, Buddha taught about skillful mean. Exactly. So if I use skillful violence to prevent greater violence, am I actually maximizing universal compassion?" The Venerable Master looked at him with the expression of someone who suspected they were being led in a philosophically questionable direction. "The question is more complex than that. But theoretically, if my violence results in less total suffering, would that be mathematically compassionate? My son, compassion is not mathematics." But if it were mathematics, piercing an aggressor to save 3 innocents would be a positive sum of universal well-being. It was the kind of logic that sounded convincing until you tried to explain it out loud. Alex decided to test his theory of compassionate violence in the next battle. It was a bigger conflict this time, an organized incursion that threatened several civilian villages, perfect for applying his new philosophy of protection through benevolent force. He spent the morning preparing spiritually, reformulating his military mission in compassionate terms. He wasn't going to fight to defeat enemies. He was going to fight to protect innocents. He wasn't going to cause violence. He was going to prevent greater violence. He wasn't going to pierce people out of anger or hatred. He was going to pierce people out of universal love for the vulnerable. It was a recontextualization that turned war into an armed humanitarian mission. "May all beings be protected," he murmured as he sharpened his spear, "especially the beings I'm protecting from the other beings." The battle began, and Alex applied his new philosophy with questionable enthusiasm. Every blow was offered as an expression of love for the civilians he was defending. Every offensive movement was recontextualized as an act of preventive compassion. For the love of the innocent, he thought, as he attacked an enemy warrior. To protect the vulnerable, he reflected, as he disarmed another opponent with considerable force. Compassion through decisive action, he contemplated as he neutralized a third threat. It was spiritually creative, but practically slightly disturbing. "Alex," said Ben after the battle, watching him wipe blood from his spear while murmuring mantras about universal well-being, "are you well?" "I'm great. I practiced applied compassion all day. Compassion that involved quite a bit of piercing people. Compassionate piercing to protect innocence." Ben looked at him with growing concern. "You know how that sounds, right? It sounds like practical application of metta in a context of social protection. It sounds like you're using Buddhist philosophy to justify enjoying battle." Alex stopped cleaning the spear. "I don't enjoy battle." "You were smiling during the fight." "I was, and humming. I was humming mantras about universal compassion." "You were humming while taking people down." It was an observation that forced Alex to reconsider if his application of compassionate violence was working as planned. "Ben," he said slowly, "perhaps I'm overcomplicating this." "Overcomplicating how?" "Perhaps I'm trying to turn war into spiritual practice instead of accepting that war and spiritual practice are different things, and that's problematic. It's problematic if I'm using metta to feel better about doing things that contradict metta." Ben considered this. "So you were using compassion to justify non-compassion?" "I was using concepts about compassionate protection to avoid confronting the fact that perhaps I enjoy being good at war." It was an uncomfortable admission that revealed layers of self-deception that Alex hadn't realized. "And that's different from authentic spiritual practice." "How?" "Authentic spiritual practice would probably involve honesty about my real motivations instead of redefining violence as non-violence." "So what are you going to do?" Alex looked at his spear, then at the battlefield where he had practiced compassion by piercing multiple people, then at the text about metta that was stained with evidence of his creative application. "Perhaps," he said, "I should stop trying to make metta conform to war and start discovering if war can conform to metta." "What's the difference?" "Honesty about contradictions instead of creative rationalization about contradictions." It was a small but significant insight about the difference between adapting spiritual teachings to justify behavior versus adapting behavior to reflect spiritual teachings. After discovering that he was using Buddhist philosophy to justify his questionable enthusiasm for combat, Alex decided to try a completely different approach. Apply universal loving kindness literally and absolutely, without rationalizations or creative adaptations, which meant trying to genuinely love people who were actively trying to kill him. It was an experiment that promised to be educational about the practical limits of universal compassion. "Venerable Master," he said during the next spiritual guidance session, "I need to clarify something about applying loving kindness." "Yes? When the texts say to extend loving kindness to enemies, is that literal?" "What do you mean, literal? Does it mean that during real combat, I should genuinely feel love for people who are trying to pierce me?" The monk was visibly uncomfortable. "Well, it's a high ideal. But practically speaking, is it possible? With sufficient spiritual development. How much development would be sufficient? That varies depending on the person. And while I'm developing that level, what do I do when someone is trying to remove my head with a sword? You do your best to maintain loving kindness in your heart. Even if that results in premature death? Well, self-defense is what's permissible. But genuine loving kindness shouldn't make self-defense unnecessary. It was a question that revealed logical contradictions that the monk clearly preferred not to examine. "It's complex," he said finally. "That seems to be your answer to all practical questions." The next battle offered the perfect opportunity to test absolute loving kindness in real conditions. Alex decided that this time there would be no rationalizations or creative redefinitions. Just a sincere attempt to feel genuine love for every person he encountered, regardless of their homicidal intentions. He spent the entire morning meditating on universal love, visualizing every possible opponent. As someone who had been an innocent baby, who had a family, dreams, fears, he cultivated genuine compassion for the shared humanity that connected all beings. When the battle began, Alex found himself face to face with an enemy warrior and tried to apply pure love. "You are a precious human being," he thought sincerely, as he dodged a blow that would have split his skull. "You have a mother who cares about you." The warrior responded with a sequence of attacks that demonstrated considerable skill and zero interest in universal family connections. "You probably have children waiting for your return home," Alex continued mentally, blocking a lunge that would have removed several important internal organs. The response was a determined attempt to turn Alex's chest into a perforated art gallery. "I genuinely wish you happiness," Alex insisted, while a growing part of his mind noted that maintaining universal love during deadly combat was, surprisingly, cognitively exhausting. Because it's hard to feel loving kindness for someone while simultaneously trying to prevent them from turning you into a military statistic. It requires a type of mental division for which no training had prepared him. "May you find peace," Alex thought as he parried another attack, "preferably far from me and without weapons." It was a slightly modified version of universal love that reflected necessary, practical adaptations. The most challenging moment came when Alex had a clear opening to decisively incapacitate his opponent. His spear was perfectly positioned. The enemy warrior was vulnerable. A simple movement would resolve the situation permanently. And Alex hesitated. "But I love this man as a brother in universal humanity," he thought, which was a philosophically beautiful reflection that almost resulted in a sword through his abdomen. Perhaps, he realized as he desperately jumped back, universal love and tactical indecision are not the same thing. The combat ended when one of his fellow soldiers intervened and resolved the situation in a less philosophically complicated way. Alex survived, but with the disturbing realization that his attempt at absolute love had almost resulted in premature death. "Alex," said Ben after the battle, "you seemed confused out there." "I was experimenting with total loving kindness." "And how did it work?" "I learned that it's possible to feel genuine love for someone who is trying to kill you, but it's practically limiting." "Limiting how?" "Genuine love makes it difficult to do things necessary to stay alive." "Is that problematic?" "It's problematic if premature death is not compatible with long-term spiritual development." Ben considered this. "So universal love during combat is counterproductive?" "Universal love during combat is poorly timed. It's hard to love someone and prevent them from killing you." simultaneously. And now I have to discover if there's a way to apply loving kindness that doesn't result in death from excessive compassion. It was a dilemma that no Buddhist text had adequately addressed. After discovering that absolute loving kindness during combat can be technically fatal, Alex decided to try a more practical approach. Apply selective loving kindness based on appropriate moments. If he couldn't love enemies while they were actively trying to kill him, perhaps he could love them in the intervals between homicide attempts. It was a creative solution that only had one small problem. Battles don't have many contemplative intervals. "Ben," he announced on a Monday morning, "today I'm going to experiment with strategically timed loving kindness." "What do you mean, strategically timed?" "Loving kindness during safe moments, military competence during dangerous moments." "And how will you switch between the two?" "I'm still developing the technical details." It was a plan that revealed impressive optimism about the possibility of controlling emotional states during life-or-death situations. The next opportunity to test came during a border patrol where they encountered a small group of bandits attacking a merchant caravan. Perfect situation to apply timed loving kindness. There were civilians to protect, enemies to love, and presumably some tactical intervals for emotional transitions. Alex approached the situation with careful planning. During the approach, he cultivated genuine love for the bandits. "You are lost human beings who probably had difficult childhoods and made questionable choices due to circumstances beyond your control." During the initial combat, he switched to military competence. "Sorry, I need to temporarily incapacitate you to protect innocents." During a pause when the bandits retreated to regroup, he returned to loving kindness. "I sincerely hope you consider career changes after this educational experience." It was a system that worked, theoretically. In practice, switching between emotional states during combat proved to be logistically complicated. "May you be happy," Alex thought as he blocked an axe blow. 2 seconds later, "but not happy in the sense of cutting me into pieces." 3 seconds later, "Actually, I genuinely wish you long-term well-being." 2 seconds later, "Only not right now while you're trying to remove my head." It was an internal conversation that required emotional multitasking for which no training had prepared him. The most educational moment came when Alex managed to disarm one of the bandits without causing serious injury. A perfect victory for his new principles, effective protection combined with minimal harm. "See," he said to the disarmed bandit, "we can resolve this without unnecessary violence. Are you okay? Do you need water? Do you have family waiting at home?" The bandit looked at him with the expression of someone who wasn't prepared for emotional therapy during a robbery. "What kind of soldier are you?" asked the bandit, confused. "A soldier practicing universal loving kindness," Alex explained. "I may have temporarily incapacitated you, but I want you to know that this comes from a place of genuine compassion for the merchants you were redistributing resources without permission." "You're preaching to me?" "I'm offering perspective on how your career choices affect other sentient beings. During a battle, during a pause in the battle, it's different." The bandit considered this. "You're the strangest soldier I've ever met." "Thank you. That's the result of trying to integrate spiritual development with military duty." "And does that work?" Alex looked around the battlefield where his companions were resolving the situation through more conventional methods, while he was having a philosophical conversation with someone who had been trying to kill him minutes earlier. "I'm still refining the process," he admitted. "May I suggest," said the bandit diplomatically, "that perhaps you're overcomplicating things." "How so?" "Well, you either fight or you love. Trying to do both at the same time seems confusing." It was a surprisingly insightful observation from someone whose profession was robbing caravans. "But Buddhist teachings say to love all beings," Alex explained, "and military teachings say to protect innocence," replied the bandit. "Perhaps you should choose which to follow at each moment. Wouldn't that be a spiritual contradiction?" "Is it more of a spiritual contradiction than trying to love someone while fighting them?" Alex paused to consider this question. It was possible that a bandit had just offered more useful practical wisdom than any monastic advice he had received. "You're suggesting," he said slowly, "that loving kindness and military competence are sequential activities, not simultaneous. I'm suggesting that trying to do everything at once is driving you crazy." "Interesting. And how would you apply that philosophy?" "Fight when you need to fight. Love when you can love. Stop trying to mix the two." "Is that practical wisdom?" "It's common sense from someone who watched you have an existential crisis during combat." It was a type of spiritual teaching that Alex hadn't expected to receive from his victim of applied, loving kindness. "May I ask a personal question?" said the bandit. "Of course. Have you always been like this? Or did Buddhism make you weird?" It was a question that Alex would spend several nights contemplating. The real crisis arrived on a Thursday afternoon when Alex realized that he had spent so much time trying to apply loving kindness in increasingly creative ways that he had completely lost touch with real loving kindness. The discovery came during a conversation with the Venerable Master, when the monk asked a simple question that revealed devastating contradictions in Alex's approach. "My son," said the monk, "have you felt inner peace during your attempts to apply loving kindness?" Alex stopped organizing his military equipment. It was a question no one had asked, including himself. "Inner peace? Yes. Genuine loving kindness should result in mental tranquility, not in anxiety about correct technical application." "Well, I've felt more concern about doing loving kindness correctly." "Ah," said the monk, "and how does that feel?" "It feels like a complicated task I need to execute perfectly. And loving kindness should feel like a task." It was a question that forced Alex to examine his internal experience honestly for the first time in weeks. "No," he admitted reluctantly. "It should feel like, well, love." "And have you felt love?" "I've felt an obligation to feel love, and anxiety about whether I'm feeling enough love, and frustration when love and military duty conflict. But real love?" Alex was quiet, processing the question. When had he last felt genuine, spontaneous, loving kindness without an agenda or tactical objective? "Honestly," he said slowly, "I don't know if I've felt real love or just a performance of love to satisfy spiritual expectations." It was an admission that revealed how much his pursuit of perfect application of loving kindness had become a technical obsession instead of emotional development. "My son," said the Venerable Master gently, "perhaps you are trying to force love instead of cultivating it." "What's the difference?" "Forced love comes from expectations about how you should feel. Cultivated love comes from understanding universal interconnectedness. And how do you know which is which? Forced love causes stress. Cultivated love causes well-being." Alex considered his recent experiences. Stress? Definitely. Well-being? Not exactly. "So I've been forcing loving kindness instead of genuinely developing it." "You've been trying to apply loving kindness as a military technique instead of feeling loving kindness as a natural state." It was a distinction that Alex hadn't considered. He had been treating loving kindness as a skill to master, not as a quality to develop. "Venerable," he said, "may I confess something?" "Certainly." "When I'm trying to love enemies during combat, I mainly feel irritation with myself for not being able to love adequately." "Ah, and when I'm trying to apply universal compassion, I mainly feel frustration about the impossible logistics of loving people who are trying to kill me. And that produces more stress, more self-criticism, more sense of spiritual failure, which is exactly the opposite of what loving kindness should produce." "Exactly. So I'm doing loving kindness wrong?" "You're doing loving kindness as if it were a military duty, with performance expectations, measurement of results and self-criticism when you don't meet impossible standards." It was an observation that explained why his entire experience had been exhausting instead of nourishing. "So what should I do differently?" Perhaps stop trying to apply loving kindness and start to simply feel loving kindness. What's the practical difference? Application comes from effort. Feeling comes from understanding. Understanding of what? That all beings, including enemies, including yourself, are trying to avoid suffering and find happiness, even when they do so in questionable ways. Alex thought about this. It was true that even the bandits he had faced were, presumably, trying to solve problems in their own imperfect way. And when I genuinely understand that, compassion arises naturally, not because you're forcing it, but because how could it not arise? And during combat. During combat, you do what you need to do to protect innocence, but you do it with the understanding that even your opponents are beings trying to find their way. Is that different from actively trying to love during a fight? Very different. It's like the difference between forcing a smile and feeling genuine joy. Alex was silent for a long moment, processing the discovery that he had turned spiritual development into a performance project with impossible metrics. Venerable, he said finally, I think I've been trying to be spiritually perfect instead of spiritually growing. And how does that feel? Exhausting, frustrating, as if loving kindness were just another item on a military to-do list. And now that you realize that, now I need to figure out how to stop trying to force love and start to simply be more loving. That sounds like a more sustainable goal and much less stressful. It was the beginning of a completely different approach to integrating spirituality and military duty. The epiphany arrived on a Sunday morning during the most improbable situation possible, while Alex was helping Ben care for an injured horse that had stepped on a trap during the last patrol. There was no combat, there were no enemies, there were no dilemmas about the technical application of loving kindness, just a suffering animal that needed care, and Alex offering help without thinking about spiritual implications or personal development goals. And it was at that exact moment of total simplicity that he finally understood what loving kindness truly meant. Slowly, he murmured to the horse as he examined the injured leg. I know it hurts, but we'll take care of it. He wasn't trying to love the horse universally. He wasn't applying contemplative techniques. He wasn't measuring his spiritual progress. He was just offering kindness to a being that was suffering. Ben, he said without taking his eyes off the wound, can I ask you a strange question? Sure. How do you feel when you're taking care of this horse? What do you mean? What emotions do you have? What thoughts go through your head? Ben considered the question. Well, concern because it's in pain, determination to help, kindness because it's vulnerable. And are you trying to feel those things? No, I'm just feeling. Exactly, said Alex, a slow understanding forming. You're not forcing compassion. It's arising naturally because you see suffering and you want to help. Is that significant? It's revolutionary. Alex continued to care for the wound, but his mind was processing a discovery that completely changed his understanding of loving kindness. He had spent months trying to manufacture compassion through conscious effort, but real compassion wasn't manufactured. It was a natural response to recognized suffering. Ben, he said, during all the battles where I tried to apply loving kindness, do you know what my main mistake was? What? I was trying to love people as a spiritual goal instead of responding to their suffering as a human reality. Explain that. Well, when I see this injured horse, I don't think I need to practice universal compassion. I think this animal is in pain and I can help. And that's different. How? It's different because compassion arises from understanding, not from obligation. Alex finished cleaning the wound and applied an improvised bandage. The horse calmed down, clearly feeling relief. You know what the irony is, he continued. When I wasn't trying to be compassionate, I was being naturally compassionate. And when you were trying to be compassionate, I was being self-consciously performative. It was a distinction that explained why his entire previous experience had been exhausting instead of nourishing. Ben, Can I tell you a realization I just had? Sure. Loving kindness isn't something you do. It's something you allow to arise when you truly see what's in front of you. What do you mean? When I see this horse, I see a being that is suffering and needs help. The natural response is to want to alleviate that suffering. I don't need to force love. Love arises from the connection with the reality of the situation. And does that apply to people too? It should. Even enemies are beings who are trying to avoid suffering in their own imperfect way. Alex sat down next to the horse, which was now resting peacefully. You know what I realized about all my attempts to apply loving kindness during combat? What? I was so focused on trying to love correctly that I wasn't really seeing the people in front of me. I was seeing targets for spiritual practice. And that's problematic because you can't genuinely love something you don't see clearly. It was a realization that revealed the fundamental difference between love as a technique versus love as recognition. Ben, said Alex, I think I finally understood why my previous approach didn't work. Why? Because I was trying to generate love through effort instead of removing obstacles to love that already exists. What obstacles? Mainly expectations about what love should look like and how it should work. Alex looked at the horse, which was clearly more comfortable, and felt a simple satisfaction that had nothing to do with spiritual achievement and everything to do with the well-being of another being. You know what the difference is between how I feel now and how I felt trying to apply loving kindness during battles? What? Now I feel peace, simplicity, as if I'm doing exactly what I should be doing. And before I felt anxiety, self-criticism, concern about spiritual performance. So genuine loving kindness feels like nothing special, like a natural and obvious response to suffering that you can alleviate. And forced loving kindness feels like hard work with impossible goals. It was a distinction that would completely change how Alex approached both spirituality and military duty. Ben, he said, standing up and admiring the peacefully resting horse, I think I've discovered how to integrate loving kindness with military responsibilities. How? Stop trying to apply loving kindness as a technique and start to be naturally responsive to suffering whoever needs protection. Does that include enemies? It includes everyone, but the appropriate response varies according to the situation. And in combat, the appropriate response might be to incapacitate someone to protect innocence. But I can do that with the understanding that even that person is a being trying to find their way. Is that loving kindness? It's loving kindness without romanticization. Practical but not insensitive. It was an approach that finally made sense both spiritually and practically. 3 months later, Alex Stone had become something he never imagined possible, a Buddhist soldier. Not in the sense that he had stopped being a soldier, or that he had stopped being a Buddhist, but in the sense that he had discovered how to be both without causing an existential crisis every morning before coffee. His military life still worked. His hands still knew how to use weapons like a musician knows how to play instruments. The difference was that now he protected people with the understanding that even those who threatened innocence were lost beings trying to find happiness through questionable methods. But the most significant change wasn't in what he did. It was in how he related to what he did. Ben, he said on a Thursday afternoon after a particularly quiet patrol, have you noticed something interesting? What? I no longer have spiritual crises before every battle. And that changes how you feel about your work. Completely. Alex cleaned his spear with movements that had become meditative. Before, every mission carried the weight of knowing it could contradict my spiritual values. Now every mission carries the intention of protecting vulnerable beings. It was a subtle but profound transformation. The skills were the same. The experience was the same. Even some of the actions were identical. But the internal understanding had changed everything. The business of being a soldier, curiously, had become more effective. Apparently, when you stop having internal debates about the technical application of loving kindness during combat, you can focus better on protecting people who need protection. You know what I discovered, Ben? What? All these months trying to apply loving kindness as a military technique, I thought I was serving spiritual development. That compassion was a goal to be achieved through conscious effort. And now? Now I see that I was serving only spiritual ego, the part of me that wanted to be perfect spiritually. Ben, who had observed Alex's entire journey with impressive patience, smiled. And what's the practical difference? The difference is that now when I protect someone, I do it because, well, someone needs protection, not because I'm trying to accumulate compassionate merits. It was a distinction that Alex had taken months to fully comprehend. He hadn't abandoned loving kindness. He had stopped using loving kindness as a self-improvement project. Ben, can I tell you about the most important change? Sure. Before, when I faced enemies, I was torn between military duty and spiritual ideals. It was like trying to serve two contradictory masters. And now I understand that protecting innocence and having compassion for aggressors are not contradictions. They are different aspects of the same response to suffering. Explain that. Well, when I see someone threatening vulnerable people, I see both the suffering of the victims and the lost path of the aggressor. The appropriate response is to protect the victims, but I can do that without hatred. And does that change how you fight? It changes because I fight with clarity instead of internal conflict. That afternoon, the Venerable Master came to visit the barracks for one of his regular lectures. After the session, he called Alex to talk. "My son," he said, "you seem different." Different how? More at peace, less anxious about spiritual development. I learned the difference between spiritual growth and trying to be spiritually perfect. "Ah," said the monk, "and what's the difference?" Spiritual growth happens naturally when you respond to suffering with wisdom. Spiritual perfection is a fantasy that causes more suffering. And how do you apply that to your military work? I do my work with the best understanding and intention I can have at the moment, without expectations of being a saint. The Venerable Master nodded. Buddha taught about gradual progress, not instant perfection. Exactly. I was trying to apply advanced teachings without developing a basic foundation. What foundation? Simple human kindness, seeing suffering and wanting to help, understanding that we are all trying to find our way. And during combat? During combat, I protect those who need protection. I do it with firmness but without anger, with effectiveness but without unnecessary cruelty. Is that loving kindness? It's loving kindness applied to real circumstances, not to ideal circumstances. 6 months later, Alex still served in the Royal Army. He still protected borders, still faced threats, still used force when necessary. The difference was that now he understood his role as a caretaker of peace through means appropriate to the situations he faced. Every mission was an opportunity to practice conscious presence. Every decision was a chance to apply practical wisdom. Every moment was a possibility to respond to suffering, his own and others, with understanding instead of automatic reaction. "Ben," he said on a Friday afternoon as they watched the sunset over the ancient temples, "you know what the final irony is?" "What?" "I searched for months for a way to apply loving kindness perfectly, and I discovered that perfect, loving kindness is simply responding to each situation with the greatest wisdom and kindness possible at the moment. And is that enough? It's real, and real is better than perfect." It was a discovery that transformed both military service and spiritual practice into a simply well-lived life. "Ben," said Alex, "you know what I learned about integrating spirituality with practical duty?" "What?" "It's not about finding spiritual techniques for difficult situations. It's about bringing genuine humanity to any situation you face. And does that work? It works because it's simple enough to be sustainable and real enough to make a difference. It was an approach that finally made sense both for the heart and for the head. And so we discover that the distance between spiritual simplicity and human complexity is exactly where real life happens. What these discoveries reveal is a universal truth. Spiritual theory and human implementation meet in the territory where ideals meet Monday morning, between what we'd like to be and what we are when someone tests our patience before coffee. The fascinating irony is that people trying to apply ancient wisdom discovered that it works, but not always in the way manuals suggest. Spiritual simplicity meets human complexity exactly when you need to make real decisions about situations that no text anticipated. The universal discovery seems to be that spiritual simplicity doesn't mean making everything simple through willpower. It means finding clarity about what truly matters, and then applying that clarity to circumstances that rarely cooperate with expectations. Because human life is complicated, it always has been, and spiritual wisdom that ignores this complication tends to create more complication. But wisdom that embraces complication with humor and humility finds natural simplicity in the midst of apparent chaos. Perhaps that's why our ancestors developed spiritual traditions, not to escape the human condition, but to navigate it with more grace, to find peace through wiser responses to imperfect circumstances. If you've made it this far, we hope these 2 hours have revealed that the spiritual quest has always been a universal human adventure, full of sincere attempts, educational failures, and discoveries that work better in practice than in theory. Because spiritual simplicity meeting human complexity is not a problem to solve. It's a human condition to embrace with a sense of humor. If these reflections resonated with you, like the video, subscribe to the channel for more explorations of ancient wisdom, meeting eternal absurdities, and hit the bell for future discoveries about humanity trying to be better. Good night, and remember, imperfect implementation is still better than theoretical perfection.